Just press push.
Oh. Hi. Hi, everybody. Buongiorno. My not very good Italian accent. Hi, everybody. I hope you're energized for some data and research. I'm Kat Matsa. I am the Director of News and Information at Pew Research Center. We are a research organization. We are based in DC, for those of you who don't know us. The main thing is that we are non-partisan and non-advocacy, so if you're asking me for advice, I will pivot. So I know we might have journalists in here, so I'm just, clarifying. So Mitali and I will let her also introduce herself. We have some exciting big trends and data. I will focus on the US. Mitali will do more of our global aspect of that, and we'll have a lovely conversation, I think.
You do the exciting bit. I'll do the data bit. I'm not sure how exciting data can be, but hopefully it can be informative. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. I'm director at the Reuters Institute for Journalism. We're a part of the University of Oxford. A lot of our work around research has been, what do audiences think? We think it's kind of the most important question when you're thinking about the journalism that you do. The good news is that it's 30 minutes. The bad news is that it's 30 minutes. So we'll try and really pace this in terms of bringing you all the big takes, and then hopefully there will be space to hold some sort of questions and answers and have a bit of an interaction. And thank you for making time for this conversation. It's always heartening to see a room full of journalists who want to engage with data, and that makes me really happy.
Yeah. So let's take it. Let's see if technology will agree with us.
There you go.
It is me, yay.
The clicker is yours.
Yes, and the clicker is mine. So, as Mitali said, we are basically also looking a lot on public opinion. We do care to see how news consumers are navigating today's news information environment. And, as I said, we are in the US. In a way, a lot of the trends and the data that we see kind of foresee what could happen globally. I'm not saying that US is always the starting point, but a lot of the technology and things that are happening and shifting, right? It's kind of like giving you an insight of how things will be going globally. So basically, I want you to think of three big takeaways, and this is work from the past 2 years that we've been doing with the Pew Night initiative. It's basically a collaboration with the Knight Foundation, which I'm sure you all or most of you have heard. And what we have seen from all this work, this is across more than a dozen of research, is this three trends, right? Basically, we have moved from a shared news environment, up until now or historically, we all had the same headlines, we were watching the same broadcast, right? All of that has moved to basically a personalization environment, a personalized one, where the focus of all this is the individual, which you see here is we used to have this institutional gatekeeping, right? Journalists, the media, right? They kind of curated, mediated the information. We have moved toward more of the individual judgment, as I say, as we find. And the other big part of this is this change from intentional seeking, right? People used to choose where to go. They used to be intentional about their news. We are seeing way more encountering, right? That accidental exposure, as we say, especially among young adults. And that has to do a lot with technology, social media, right? All of that environment. I'm not going to focus so much in kind of distilling each of these. I wanted to kind of show you the three big takeaways. What I really want to do and push past a bit of this and go a bit deeper is what people actually want from news now, right? And whether journalism is actually delivering. Sorry, I'm managing two screens. So this is from a very recent work we just released in February. And one of the things that we are seeing and I call it's the constant negotiation that people have to go through every day in their lives. And I want you to sit with it because it's super important. People want to be informed. An overwhelming majority believe that that's their civic duty, right? That it's a responsibility to be informed. But actually, much fewer believe that following the news, right, that activity is actually what is delivering that responsibility. And the other part of this is that they're exhausted. And there's no enjoyment. They feel very overwhelmed. And if you take a step back, right, and I'm assuming that most of you here are journalists, right? For an average person, we're asking them basically to go through information and news all day, every day, being bombarded, trying to assess it, figure out its credibility, where it's coming from, the sources, whether it's true or not, right? That is a lot of work, right? So that's what I'm calling like, it's my shorthand in my head, like this constant negotiation, right? That the average news consumer is doing. Sorry. Okay. The other part of this is that the platform shift, right, is real. The idea of technology that has shifted how people consume news, it's real, it's here. And what you are seeing here from our work is like who is doing that news role, right? Like who is actually fulfilling journalism in those platforms. And what you see is that creators, influencers, you can choose your term, are actually fulfilling this role. There's a growing share of Americans, this is all US data, that are getting their news from these individuals. A lot of it is on social media. Some of it is in podcasting as well. And the share actually grows even more among young adults, right? You see that here it's 38%. This is the most recent data we have from this past October. And the key here is that people go there because, one, it actually helps them understand what's happening. They go for breaking news. They think they are delivering it in a better way, but also for authenticity. And we can talk about what that means. We have done some work, also qualitative work about this. The other key part here, as you see, is that a majority of them, and whether you look at the influencers, we've done work at looking at the actual influencers and the content and who they are, but also we've asked the public, and in both cases, the majority don't have a newsroom background, right? And I'm sure you know creators there, they're doing a lot of work on that, and maybe they're colleagues, but when you're looking at that cohort, they don't have a journalism background, most of them. Before I finish, the next thing that I think it's important, and that's, I would say, a bit more specific to the US, but I do think that it's an alarm, and I want to actually really emphasize on this, is local news. And local news in the US has always been an exception in terms of like the forces that they have been impacting national news, trust, right, the following and all of that, the exhaustion that we were just talking. Local news was not impacted by all this. This is shifting, this is changing. This is data we just published this week. I don't know what day it is today. Today is Friday. So we just published it on Tuesday. And I would like to emphasize, because for the first time we're seeing polarization creeping in. We didn't have this type of divide in local news. Local news was about equally trusted by Republicans and Democrats. There was not a wide gap. Local news was something that felt close to home. It was important. We actually see a drop in how people value local news. So the share that says that it's important has dropped in the past year, 10 percentage points, which is kind of like remarkable. So the one thing that I would say that it's worth watching, especially for the US-centric audience, is that this is a real change that it's happening. We are monitoring, but it's something new. I will finish basically with a question that I would love to open up later, and I'm sure Mitali will agree, like it's worth discussing, right? Like, if we see that people don't believe that by following the news, right, is how they fulfill their information needs, where does journalism stand, right? How do you make the case to be trusted, to be fulfilling those needs? And with that, I'll turn it to Mitali.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent setup. Yeah, thank you. So I think what you saw is kind of quite a concise snapshot of what the picture looks like in the United States. As promised, this is a bit more of a global span. So one of the things we do at the Institute, and forgive me if this is sort of old news for loyal listeners, but we do the digital news report, which looks at news and audiences, and has done for 14 years. This year we sort of spanned close to 50 markets, so it's very international and really represents a lot of the world. One thing we sort of paused to do this year in the middle of all the madness that research generally presents is think about young audiences in specific. I think some of the questions on our mind were responses to what we heard from the industries, such as, are young audiences turning away from the news? Are young audiences less trusting? And I suppose the most sort of interesting one was, do young audiences grow up? Essentially, do they turn 30 and then start subscribing to a newspaper and developing a news habit? I'm sorry to sort of, break that bubble and say the answer is no. And the data will kind of walk you through that. So what you'll see in some of my slides is some of it is longitudinal. And for the longitudinal research, we narrowed it down to the 9 countries that we began this research with. And then some of it is sort of snapshots in moments of time. And I think there's 2 ways to look at what's happening with young audiences. One, as you referred to, is structural, which is how are they accessing it? What are the gateways? What are the mediums? What are the formats? And the other is attitudes. And are these attitudes significantly different from those of a different generation, 55 plus, 35 to 44? So let me quickly dive in the interest of time. This is, as I said, based on the digital news report spanning the last 10 countries. And someone asked me this, and I thought it was a brilliant question, and I should have explained it. When we say young audiences, we mean people from the age of 18 to 24. So that's the reference range, just to be clear. This is an online survey, and as such, comes with the sort of shortcomings that an online survey should have associated with it. In some, it's not the first language. We conduct the surveys in English. So in markets like India, for example, there may be some divergence both in terms of the socioeconomic status of people responding and also their language capabilities. But that's really the size, structure, and breakup. And that's the methodology. This was an online poll conducted in Jan to Feb 2025. Time is a blur, but you may recall this was quite peak kind of post-Trump, what happens now sort of mood and vibe. So the first question to ask is, where are young people getting their news? And I think if you were to look at the span of the last 10 years, this is where you have seen the most fundamental shift, which is that young people are now, 39% of them, saying that their main gateway in terms of getting news is via social media. Compare that to 10 years ago, where 21% said that they were accessing news via social media. And I think that is the biggest sort of structural shift that we're looking at. It's not about young people going online. That's old news. They did that a long time ago. 10 years ago, they were getting it from Facebook to a lesser degree, but now they're on different platforms and overwhelmingly so, as you can see. And I think when we talk about digital natives, it's important to specify that this generation has been, of course, digital native, but more importantly, they are social native, which means that all their engagement online is to a large majority through the pathways of social media, certainly so for news, and certainly tends to be more incidental and less sort of intentional when they are engaging with the news. So what platforms are young people using for news? And I think that's the other big shift that we've seen in the last few years. As I said, 10 years ago, young people were on Facebook and they were getting some news from there, but that's changed quite sharply. The biggest sort of platform at this point is Instagram. So video first, audio as well. Instagram has seen a very sharp increase. I think TikTok has been quite dramatic, even though it's like a small bar because it came into the game a bit later, but very sharp increases as well. And then alongside that, you can see a big shift in terms of a decline in Facebook as a preferred social media platform for young people. It is still preferred, but by the 55 plus. I would also add there's a little bit of an algorithmic decision here where Facebook a few years back made the decision to essentially shift its votes away from news. And part of it is also a function of that, and it's important to recognize that. So young people prefer watching. Just to sort of qualify that, it is still globally a preferred method to read, but increasingly so amongst young people, they would prefer to watch or listen, or both. Vodcasts is the new phenomenon on YouTube where you're basically looking at someone talking to the other person with a big mic in front. So what sources are people paying attention to while they are on social video? And you alluded to that a little bit, and I think that's where the news creator piece comes in, where, as you can see, for young people, more than 50% are paying attention to creators or personalities rather than traditional media while they're online. It is interesting to note that this is not just an 18 to 24 phenomenon. If you were to sort of stretch that all the way to the 44-year-olds, it's almost neck and neck. It is much more sort of differentiated for the 55 plus generation, but young people are on social media and seem to be gravitating to content creators. There's lots of reasons that young people point to. There is a level of authenticity. I think the decoding strength is something that young people talk about, which is sort of sense making and context setting, which is what they find amongst news creators. To be clear, there are trust concerns that exist amongst young people as well, but this is the preferred medium for them. Maybe there's something about that style, which is very conversational, it's very casual, and it's quite appealing to young people. I'll just go quickly through this because I imagine you've attended other content creator conversations, but we built a little bit of a typology. So when you're looking online at news creators, there's a couple of genres there. One, the commentary piece, think Joe Rogan style, sort of 2-hour stream of consciousness conversations. It tends to be mostly male. It does tend to be partisan in its content, and it tends to be more popular with right-leaning content at this point in time. Then there's the news and investigation space. This is a far slimmer pillar. One, because many of these individual creators don't have the sort of resources that large organizations do. They have a big team. They have the ability to really plow into a story. And that's really a strength, I think, for mainstream media organizations to hold on to. So there are some examples, but they don't post often. And it does take a lot of work. And some of these are former journalists who've now essentially gone solo on social media. And then you have this space that's done incredibly well for content creators with young people, which is the explainers, the sense-making, as I was saying. Hugo Decrypt is, a very well-known face in France, and he sort of pioneered that movement of making sense of the news for young people. And then you've got this other genre of specialists. So people who talk about one thing and you know what you go for. Generally speaking, when I mention the name of Fabrizio Romano, there's lots of nodding heads in the room. So I don't know if there's football fans here, but he's certainly the one who's associated with breaking a lot of stories, very popular amongst football fans. And then Taylor Lorenz, formerly with the Washington Post, now talking about culture and lifestyle, but doing that online. You can go online and find that. We've done a piece on news creators across 24 countries with the typology, some big takeaways, all of that. So how frequently are young people consuming news? As you can see, from about 2017, there is a dip across all categories. There is certainly a dip amongst young people where it's gone from about 79% down to much lower levels. I'm going back to the point about it being incidental because I think that does have a role to play in how often people are tapping in and consuming news, because they're on social media platforms for different reasons. It could be to pass time, it could be to engage with friends, or a wholly other reason, which is why it tends to be a bit more peripheral, their connection with the news. If any of you have kind of a 15-year-old in the room and you ask them what's happening, trust me, they know what's happening. They just didn't get there the way you did. But they are across it, but they're at it at a slightly more peripheral level. I think that's one way of looking at it. How interested are young people in news? I think this is the one where you've seen a quite precipitous change over the last couple of years. So again, to be clear, it's fallen in terms of news interest, and you mentioned really important reasons for that over the last couple of years, but it is much sharper amongst young people. So 35% from 60% in about 2013 saying they actually have an interest in news. And Kirsten Eddy, who is sort of a common colleague, is now at Pew and used to be at Reuters, did some really interesting work in the US around news definitions. And I think that's a good starting point, which is how do young people think about news? What is news to their minds? Is it the standard sort of hard political business news? Or is it a much broader interpretation of what actually constitutes news in their minds? So I think they're looking for more fun, interesting, engaging topics. And that's one thing to look at while looking at this kind of quite sharp fall in terms of news interest. The next one is, by the way, I'm happy to share these slides or have them kind of passed along if that's useful. And you'll find all of this on our website in any case. The next question is around news avoidance. And I think this was quite interesting because a lot of the feedback that comes through is that young people are just not interested in the news. But if you look at this bar, it's almost equal for a lot of age groups. It's certainly true for the 25 to 34s, also for those up to 44. And young people also tend to avoid the news, perhaps a little bit more than others. But I think the differentiator here is around the reasons. So overwhelmingly, all age groups tell us that they avoid the news because they find it overwhelming, depressing, it affects their mood. But young people more specifically point to the fact that they tend to avoid the news because they find it difficult to understand. There is an accessibility question here, and I think that's really important to kind of think about as news organizations, where it's not just what it's doing to their mood, it's also an accessibility issue. They're struggling to understand what this means. Imagine going onto a website and seeing sort of a minute-by-minute breakdown of what's happening in Iran, when really your question is, what is happening in Iran? Can someone start from the start? And I think that's a really valid question to ask of a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old. AI, 10 minutes. I will go even faster. I'm sorry, guys. A quick word on AI and how people are using it. So definitely much more usage amongst young people turning to AI. As you can see, almost double from the 35 to 44. So 15% of the young generation saying they use it on a weekly basis to access the news. How are they using it? And this goes back to the accessibility point, where some people across the older age groups are turning to news for kind of the latest news or for a follow-up question. But I'd like you to look at the point about both news evaluation, as also I asked it to make a news story easier to understand. And 48% of young people say that's what they're turning to it for. We now sort of shift to the attitude piece that I was talking about. What do young people think about the news? So in quite broad terms, it's actually not dissimilar to how other age groups think about the news, both in terms of trust, in terms of how fairly you're covered. I think on impartiality, there's a little bit of nuance where some young people feel on some topics like climate change or racism, there is no impartiality. That's sort of, it's clear what their stand is on that, but they think quite similarly to previous generations in a slightly different degree. So I would say in this situation, it is a matter of degrees rather than a completely sharp and different take. So here's quick kind of takeaways for you. Social first, which means this is an infrastructure and structural issue. Experimental, so definitely leaning into news creators, certainly leaning a bit more than previous generations into AI chatbots. Less interested in what we traditionally call news by way of definition, and looking at kind of broadening that topic out, which is why, interestingly, on news creators, you'll see some of them talk about wholly different issues and sometimes slip in commentary about news as well, and very, very different in terms of access and attitudes. I hope this has been useful, and I'm very happy to hold whatever space there is left for questions and answers to us both. But thank you. Thanks for your attention and time.
Okay. Oh, perfect. We have the microphone.
Hi, thank you so much for your insights on this. I'm 20 years old, so I'm quite young, and I think I'm
You're a survey respondent.
Exactly. And I wanted to ask, I am a social media consumer. I'm a news consumer on social media, among other ways of consuming news. And I was thinking, you talked about accessibility of information, accessibility of news coverage, because, for example, I see on the news on television when I'm at my grandparents' house, for example, I only watch the news on television when I'm at their house. And I see, for example, that there are a lot of older people inside television nowadays. So as a young person, I don't feel represented inside the news. But I understand, of course, that experts are older people in general. So I was wondering, can this matter of accessibility be fixed by putting maybe younger people on television, or should we shift more intentional news reporting on social media, for example, by creating, I don't know, a sort of news inside social media platform to create a more intentional ways of consuming news?
I can give it a quick go,
Yeah,
and I'd be keen to hear from you as well. The first thing to say is that I'm not in a newsroom, so I'm not sort of sitting here and prescribing to organizations what they should or shouldn't do. That's very much a function of their own decisions. The second thing I would say is that there is no either or. I think all of this can happen, and it is happening. It's just happening in really small pockets. I was chairing a news creator conversation yesterday where one of the panelists essentially runs a newsroom for the young people. So it's a small group, it's about 10 people, but it is young journalists thinking about talking to other young people in a format and a style that works for them. That certainly means thinking about a presence on social media, as you say. And if there is an old talking head on television, so be it. But is there a way to broaden out and build that context and sense making? There's a reason why explainers are doing well, right? So, is there something we can take from that expertise and build it into something that is much more what young people are used to and what their own sort of habit of consumption is?
I would say that let's reframe what you just said, right? Because you're thinking about it, you're framing it as accessibility when the thing is that news has fundamentally changed to an experiential consumption, right? And that's something we need to sit with. It's not that, you're going to put young people on TV, right? And I get the point, right? We don't see that in our data. Anytime we've asked qualitatively on surveys, why do you go to news influencers? Why do you do X, Y, Z? The things that come up are, we better understand, we find the same things. It helps me better understand. They're quicker, better, production of things. I relate and find authenticity, which is what kind of you're talking about, but it is also this idea that I'm there, I'm experiencing, I'm relating. So the one thing that I would say, representation comes a lot when it comes to, it rises into our data when it comes a lot in terms of like race and ethnicity, for instance. That matters, especially when reporters are covering issues in the US, at least, that matter in terms of racial tensions, social issues that have to do with race and ethnicity. That, the reporter's identity matters a lot. Age hasn't come up as an issue. So I would say it's more of like how people experience this. And we are seeing actually that, yes, the gaps, for instance, of accidental and intentional seeking, right, there for older audiences, but it's not that there isn't a share of older adults, right, that they also are on social media and accident, and that's actually is rising. So that shift is happening. There's one there, 2, 3.
Well, thank you for all the information. I'm Arden, I'm from the Netherlands, and I work for a social media platform that's connected to a newspaper. And I was wondering what I see in the Netherlands around me. I'm 21 years old, so I'm also a young adult. We take a lot of information, news information from social media platforms from news platforms. And I think it's very dangerous that influencers are talking about the news without a background. And I was wondering, is the responsibility that the audience goes to those influencers instead of news platforms, is that the responsibility from the news platforms or from the audience?
Yeah, the question is, if you're thinking about audiences, do we really think that with everything that I described and I think Mitali described, they could actually navigate this? Even if you're, like, think about yourself, right? You are in a sea of information. That's what we're seeing, and that's why I keep calling it as the constant negotiating, right? It is a lot. It's a big burden on an average consumer to actually ask them to be the best civic person, right, that does research every day to see what the source is. Like, it's a lot, right? So I'm not here to say who has a responsibility or not. You know, someone could say everyone should have the responsibility. The reality is that all of this is there. People are going there. There's something that is attracting them. That's what's happening. Like, I don't know how to give it like an advice on it, but it's the reality of.
I mean, I will say the first sort of challenge with the news creator universe that you point to is a definitional challenge, in the sense that there's so much that goes into that melting pot. So you have a Joe Rogan on the one hand, but you also have incredibly talented legacy journalists who have decided to shift to social media for different reasons. I'm from India. A lot of really respected news persons have shifted to social media only because they find more independence in terms of critical reporting there. So it's not one size fits all. I think the other thing to acknowledge, if we would like to do that, is if journalism sees itself as a public good, then it should be serving the public, which means it's important to start listening to audiences and what they want and how they want it and how they like to receive it. And treating the two as sort of two individual islands, I'm not sure it's the best way. There are a few really great examples, and you're from the Netherlands, and you know, I'm sure the whole world of journalism would like to bubble with the Netherlands in terms of how news is consumed there and the kind of loyalty that audiences have towards a news habit. But it didn't happen overnight, did it? It's kind of it's cultural, it's structural, and I think part of it is the question of what is the value that you add to my life. And I think for both news organizations and content creators and anyone who's kind of in the business of talking about things that impact people's lives, you must constantly be thinking about what is the value that I add to your life by you engaging with me. Is there a world in which they partner and find kind of common values? Perhaps there is. At this point, we're not there. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, and I mean, the value then, it's the money, right? That's when the business structure of things happen, right? Like, you don't see the value, and what we find is that a tiny share of Americans are actually paying for news, right? So thinking about sustainability and the business models, right? And we are way far from advertising years, right? How does that, like, you have to see how these are connected, right? We're closed. come and
It's done.
we're X'd.
But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to repeat, if you'd like the slides, I'm happy to speak to the organizers
Yes.
and have that shared. Thank you for your time.
You.